There is a road in Louisiana. Long, flat, and quiet, flanked by pine trees on both sides, it cuts through the morning mist like a thread through linen. Spanish moss hangs from the branches overhead. The air smells like pine resin and damp earth and the particular stillness that only exists in the American South before the day has fully decided to begin. If you drove that road today, you wouldn't think twice about it. You'd roll down the window maybe, let the cool air in, watch the trees blur past and think about whatever you think about on quiet drives, the day ahead, the coffee in your cup, the song on the radio. But on the 23rd of May, 1934, that road was the last thing two people ever saw. Their names were Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, and depending on who you ask, who you were, where you lived, whether your family had money in the bank, or whether the bank had already taken everything you owned, they were either the most dangerous criminals in American history, or two kids from nothing who simply ran out of road. The truth, as it usually does, sits somewhere between those two things, and it is more interesting than either of them. To understand Bonnie and Clyde, you have to understand the world that made them, not just their individual circumstances, though we'll get to those. You have to understand the larger world, the country, the specific, grinding, exhausting reality of being poor in America in the first decades of the 20th century. Because that reality is the soil from which this story grows, and without it, Bonnie and Clyde are just two names on a wanted poster. With it, they become something more complicated, something that still makes people uncomfortable in ways they can't quite explain. So let's start at the beginning, the real beginning, not 1930 when they met, not 1932 when the robberies began, but earlier, much earlier. Let's start with the land. Texas in the early 1900s was a place of enormous contrast. In the cities, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, there was money, there was industry. The early stirrings of the oil boom were beginning to reshape the economic landscape in ways that would eventually make Texas one of the wealthiest states in the Union. Department stores were opening, automobiles were appearing on paved streets, electricity was spreading into homes. But the cities were not where most Texans lived. Most Texans lived in places like Rowena, like Tellico, like the dozens of small farming communities and sharecropping towns scattered across the vast flat expanse of the state, where the land was worked by hand from before sunrise to after sunset, and where the gap between a good year and a catastrophic one was measured in inches of rainfall. These were communities built almost entirely on agriculture, cotton farming primarily, in the eastern and central regions, and cotton farming in the early 1900s was a precarious business at the best of times. The land was demanding, the weather was unpredictable, the prices that farmers received for their crops were set by markets they had no control over and could barely understand. And layered over all of that was the credit system. In the tenant farming and sharecropping communities of rural Texas, most families didn't own their land. They worked it, and they worked it under arrangements that, to a modern eye, look uncomfortably close to indentured servitude. The landlord provided the land. The farmer provided the labor. At the end of the season, the harvest was split, but not before the farmer's debts were accounted for. Debts for seed, for tools, for the small advance that had kept the family fed during the winter months when there was no income. The arithmetic of these arrangements almost never resolved in the farmer's favor. You could work an entire year, 12 months of brutal physical labor, through heat and cold and drought and flood, and end the season owing more than you started with, generation after generation. This was the world into which Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were born. Not a world of dramatic, visible cruelty, a world of slow, structural, invisible suffocation. A world where the rules were made by people who didn't live in it, and where the people who did live in it had very few options for changing anything about their circumstances. Hard work was not a path out. Plenty of people worked hard and died poor. education was not reliably a path out. Schools in rural Texas were underfunded and inconsistent, and children were often needed at home during planting and harvest seasons. The options for most people in these communities were narrow: stay, work, hope, and try to pass anything on to your children that might give them slightly more room than you had. Some people found their way out, through luck, through talent, through connections, through the sheer grinding persistence that the American mythology of self-reliance celebrates so enthusiastically. But most people stayed, and a small number of people, a very small number, but a number that grew during hard times, looked at those narrow options and decided to find a different road entirely, the road outside the law. That road had its own costs, its own dangers, its own dead ends, but for some people, in some circumstances, it felt like the only road that went anywhere at all. This is not a justification of what Bonnie and Clyde did. It is an explanation of the world that produced them, and explanations matter, not because they excuse, but because without them we learn nothing. We just shake our heads at the names on the wanted poster and move on, and this story deserves more than that, so does every story. Now, let's talk about Bonnie. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born on the 1st of October, 1910, in Rowena, Texas, a small community in Runnels County, roughly in the center of the state. She was the second of 3 children born to Charles and Emma Parker. Charles Parker was a bricklayer, a skilled tradesman, which put the family in a slightly better position than many of their neighbors. Tradesmen earned more reliably than farmers, and their work was less dependent on the weather. The family was not comfortable by any stretch, but they were not on the edge of ruin either. By all accounts, Emma Parker was the gravitational center of the family. She was disciplined, organized, devoted to her children, and possessed of a practicality that was less a personality trait than a survival skill. She believed in education. She believed in hard work. She believed in keeping the family together. Bonnie absorbed all of this. She was, by every account that survives, an exceptional child, academically gifted, socially confident, and possessed of a personality that filled whatever room she was in. Her teachers remembered her decades later. Her classmates remembered her. She was small. She would never grow taller than about 4 feet 11 inches, but she had a presence that made her seem larger than she was. She loved language above everything. Words were, from a very early age, the thing she turned to when the world needed making sense of. She read voraciously. She wrote constantly, stories, poems, letters. She entered school writing competitions and won them. She memorized poems and recited them with a flair that made her teachers smile. She wanted more than anything to do something with words, to write, to perform, to make people feel things with language the way language made her feel things, and then, just before her 5th birthday, her father died. Charles Parker's death in 1914 was not a dramatic event in the historical record. He was a bricklayer who died young, in a small Texas town, in a time before social safety nets or life insurance or government assistance programs. His death left Emma with 3 children, no income, and the particular kind of grief that doesn't have time to fully arrive because there is too much to do. Emma made a decision quickly. She packed up her children and moved them to Cement City, a working-class neighborhood on the western edge of Dallas where her parents lived. In the economy of the poor, as I said earlier, proximity to family was a form of wealth. Emma Parker understood this instinctively. Cement City was not beautiful. It was not aspirational. It was a neighborhood of small wooden houses and unpaved streets, populated largely by working-class families and day laborers. The kind of neighborhood that cities of that era produced in abundance, necessary, utilitarian, invisible to the people who lived in nicer parts of town. But it had schools, and Emma Parker sent her children to them. Bonnie thrived. She was, in the schools of Cement City and the surrounding area, consistently at the top of her class. Spelling, composition, public speaking. She won awards, She was remembered by teachers with that specific warmth reserved for students who make the work feel worthwhile. And she grew up, as young women in working-class Dallas in the 1920s did, with an awareness of the gap between her inner life and her outer circumstances. She had ambitions that her world didn't have obvious places for. She dreamed of stages and pages and audiences. She lived in a neighborhood where the expected trajectory was marriage and housekeeping by 20. She managed to hold out until 16. His name was Roy Thornton. He was handsome, as Bonnie would later describe him, and charming in the way of young men who have charm as a primary asset because they don't have much else. They married in September of 1926. Bonnie was 16 years old. She had the words Roy and Bonnie tattooed on her inner right thigh, a gesture of commitment that, in retrospect, reads as unbearably young. The marriage was, in the polite language of historical accounts, troubled. Roy Thornton was unreliable. He disappeared for stretches without explanation. He came back without apology. He was, it seems, the kind of person who is more appealing at a distance than he is in a shared life. Bonnie endured it with the patience of someone who had grown up understanding that life didn't always give you what you'd hoped for. By 1929, Roy Thornton was in prison, sentenced to 5 years for robbery. Bonnie never divorced him, partly because divorce was expensive, partly because it carried a significant social stigma in her community, and partly, perhaps, because she had a stubborn streak that refused to admit the marriage had failed entirely. She simply continued wearing his ring and living her life as though the marriage were in a long, indefinite pause. She was 19 years old. She rented a room in Dallas. She found work as a waitress at a cafe called Marcos, where she was by all accounts an excellent employee, fast, friendly, remembered fondly by the regular customers who came in for coffee and pie, and the particular comfort of a familiar face. She wrote poems on her order pads during slow shifts. She was waiting for something. She didn't know yet what it was. 20 miles away, more or less, a boy named Clyde Chestnut Barrow was learning something that would define the rest of his short life. He was learning that the system was not built for him. And he was learning this not through political education or philosophical reflection, but through the simple, repeated experience of having the system demonstrate it, over and over, in ways he couldn't misunderstand. Clyde was born on the 24th of March, 1909, in Tellico, Texas, a community in Ellis County south of Dallas. He was the fifth of 8 children born to Henry and Kumi Barrow. Henry was a farmer. Kumi was, by all historical accounts, a woman of extraordinary resilience. She had to be, to raise 8 children under the circumstances she was raising them in. The Barrow family's poverty was not the genteel, managed kind. It was the raw kind, the kind where decisions about food and shelter are made on a daily basis, where the margin between getting by and not getting by is razor thin and cuts both ways. When Clyde was still in grade school, Henry Barrow made the same calculation that Emma Parker had made, that the city might offer something the land hadn't. He loaded his family into a wagon and moved them to Dallas. But unlike Emma Parker, who had family waiting for her in Cement City, Henry Barrow arrived in Dallas with nothing arranged, for a period. The exact length is debated by historians, but long enough to matter. The Barrow family lived under a bridge near the Trinity River because they couldn't afford anywhere else to stay. 8 children, a wagon, a bridge over a river. I want you to sit with that image for a moment because I think it is easy to read it quickly and move past it. But it is the foundational image of Clyde Barrow's childhood. It is the thing that, when you understand it, makes everything else about him make a certain kind of terrible sense. He was a child. He slept under a bridge because his family had no other options. In a city, in America, in the 20th century. Eventually, Henry Barrow scraped together enough to rent a small plot of land near the Eagle Ford neighborhood of West Dallas, where he set up a small filling station. It was barely a business, but it was something. It was a roof and a floor, and a place where the family could be together, which was more than the bridge had offered. West Dallas, where the Barrows eventually settled, was one of those neighborhoods that cities produce when they need somewhere to put the people they'd rather not think about. It was across the Trinity River from the wealthier parts of Dallas, physically separated, literally, by water, and it was a community of poverty and overcrowding and the particular social texture that those conditions create. Crime was not uncommon in West Dallas. It was, in many ways, one of the available industries. The legitimate options for young men in that neighborhood in the 1920s were limited. Manual labor, day work, whatever you could find. The illegitimate options were more varied and, in some cases, more immediately remunerative. Clyde Barrow grew up watching both. But here is something worth knowing about Clyde before we get to any of that. He was by nature sensitive. That word doesn't fit the legend, I know. But it fits the person. He was deeply attached to his family, to his mother Kumi especially, and to his older brother Buck, who would become both his closest companion and, eventually, one of the casualties of the road they chose together. He was, by multiple accounts, affectionate and loyal to the people he cared about, in a way that sat oddly next to the violence that would define his public life, and he had a genuine deep love of music. Clyde Barrow played the saxophone and the guitar, not as a hobby, with real ability. People who knew him in those years described him as a genuinely talented musician. He played at family gatherings. He played for his own comfort. He played, it seems, as a way of accessing some interior life that the hard exterior of West Dallas didn't otherwise allow. There is something unbearably poignant about this, in retrospect. A boy who grew up under a bridge, who developed into a talented musician, who loved his mother, who was loyal to his brother, and who also became one of the most wanted men in American history. These things are not contradictions. They are the same person. This is what I mean when I say the story refuses to be simple. Clyde's first arrest came in 1926 when he was 17. Failure to return a rented car. It sounds almost comic as a first offense, but it was the beginning of a pattern, and the pattern escalated. Over the next several years, Clyde was arrested multiple times for a variety of offenses: car theft, burglary, safecracking. He did short stints in local jails. He was released. He went back. Each time he went back, the cycle tightened. There is a debate among criminologists and historians about what exactly turns a person from petty crime to something more serious. Some people commit minor offenses in their youth and stop. Others don't. The variables are complex: opportunity, social network, individual psychology, the presence or absence of alternative paths. In Clyde's case, the alternative paths were not obvious. He had limited education. He had a record that made legitimate employment increasingly difficult. He had grown up in a community where crime was a known, if not entirely respectable, profession. And he had begun to understand, in the way of someone who has had their face pressed against the glass of American prosperity for their entire life, that the game was not designed for him to win. By the late 1920s, Clyde Barrow was running with a loose circle of young men who operated on the margins of legality in West Dallas. Nothing organized, nothing particularly sophisticated, small-time stuff mostly. And then, in November of 1929, the American economy collapsed. The stock market crash of October 1929, Black Tuesday, as history remembers it, did not immediately affect the Clyde Barrows and Bonnie Parkers of the world in the way it affected Wall Street investors. People who have nothing don't lose much when the markets crash. But the crash set off a chain of events that filtered down, relentlessly, through every layer of the American economy, until it reached the very bottom, and the very bottom had nowhere left to fall. Banks began to fail. Local banks, community banks, the institutions that held the modest savings of working families. When they failed, the savings were simply gone. There were no government guarantees, no FDIC, No safety net, businesses closed. Workers were laid off. The unemployment rate climbed from 3% in 1929 to nearly 25% by 1933. In some communities, particularly the industrial cities of the Midwest and the farming towns of the South, it was higher than that, and it kept going. This is the economic landscape into which Bonnie and Clyde's story unfolds. And it matters because the Depression didn't just create poverty, it created a widespread, deeply felt sense that the system had failed, that the institutions which were supposed to protect ordinary people had either collapsed or had never really been working for ordinary people to begin with. Banks had taken people's savings. Landlords were evicting families who couldn't make rent. The government, at least in the early years of the Depression, seemed either unable or unwilling to do much about any of it. Into this landscape, the figure of the outlaw, the person who rejected the rules of the system that had failed everyone, took on a specific, charged meaning. It was January of 1930 when Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow met. The specifics are well documented, at least in outline. A mutual friend named Clarence Clay had a house in West Dallas. Bonnie was visiting a girlfriend there, helping her make hot chocolate in the kitchen after the friend had broken her arm. Clyde came by, as he often did. He walked into the kitchen. She was standing at the stove. There are several accounts of this moment, from friends who were present, from Emma Parker's later recollections, from the letters that Bonnie and Clyde would write over the following years. All of them agree on one thing: whatever happened in that kitchen was immediate and total. People who knew them both said they'd never seen either of them react to another person that way. Clyde, who was known among his circle as someone who kept a certain distance emotionally, was visibly different around Bonnie, open, lighter, like a room with a window in it. And Bonnie, who had spent years waiting for something without knowing what it was, seemed suddenly to know. Within a week they were inseparable. Within 3 weeks, Clyde was arrested. It was the 14th of February, 1930, Valentine's Day. The arrest was on multiple counts of car theft and burglary. He was taken to the Waco jail while awaiting trial. Bonnie, who had known this man for barely a month, smuggled a gun into the jail. He used it to escape. He was recaptured 6 days later in Ohio, turned in by a family friend. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in the Texas State Penitentiary at Huntsville. Then the sentence was amended. He was transferred to a prison farm, a place called Eastham. And Eastham is where we have to stop and talk about what the Texas prison system was in 1930, because it is impossible to understand what Clyde Barrow became without understanding what Eastham made him. Eastham Prison Farm was not a correctional facility in any meaningful sense of that word. It was a labor camp. Prisoners worked the fields from before dawn to after dark, in Texas heat, under the supervision of guards who had nearly unlimited authority to use violence as a management tool. The historical record on conditions at Eastham is unambiguous. It was brutal. Physical punishment was common, often severe. Abuse of many kinds was systematic. The men who went into Eastham were not, in the main, treated as human beings who might one day re-enter society. They were treated as labor to be extracted. Clyde Barrow served time at Eastham from 1930 to 1932. What exactly happened to him there is not entirely known. He spoke of it rarely and guardedly. But the accounts that do exist, from fellow prisoners, from family members who noticed the change in him, are consistent. He went in as a small-time car thief. He came out as something else. The specific incident most often cited in historical accounts is this: Clyde, who was being repeatedly assaulted by another prisoner, arranged for that prisoner to be beaten so severely that he died. Whether Clyde carried out the assault himself or arranged for others to do so is unclear. What is clear is that it happened, and that it represented a line being crossed from petty crime and recklessness into deliberate, calculated violence. He also, during his time at Eastham, had several toes cut off, either at his own request or with his assistance, in order to secure a transfer away from the most brutal work assignments. The injury was severe enough to give him a permanent limp. When Clyde Barrow walked out of Eastham on the 6th of February, 1932, he had been fundamentally changed by what he had experienced. The sensitivity was still there, it never entirely left him by all accounts, but it was now armored, enclosed. And he had made a decision that people who had known him before recognized immediately, even if they couldn't articulate it precisely. He was never going back. Not to Eastham, not to any prison, not to any room with a locked door and someone else holding the key. Whatever it cost, he was never going back. Bonnie was there when he was released. She had waited 2 years, writing letters, visiting when she could, continuing to waitress and write her poems and maintain the appearance of an ordinary life. She had waited. And now here he was. And within weeks of his release, they were moving. If you're finding this story worth your time, and I hope you are, consider subscribing to the channel. It's the best way to make sure you find your way back here for this story and for the ones still to come. Now, back to the road. The Barrow Gang. The name sounds organized, intentional, like something that was planned in a back room with a map on the table and roles assigned in advance. The reality was considerably messier than that. In the spring and summer of 1932, what would eventually become the Barrow Gang was less a criminal organization than a loose, shifting collection of young people who were making it up as they went. Clyde gathered around him a rotating cast of companions, friends from West Dallas, acquaintances from his criminal network, people who had nothing particular to lose and nowhere particular to be. The core of the group in those early months was Clyde, Bonnie, and a man named Ray Hamilton, a young criminal from West Dallas who was in some ways a more natural outlaw than Clyde. Hamilton was charming and reckless in roughly equal measure, and he and Clyde had a relationship that oscillated between close friendship and mutual antagonism throughout the years they spent in each other's orbit. The crimes they committed in those early months were not sophisticated: small-town grocery stores, gas stations, occasionally a bank, though the banks were rarely the dramatic heists of popular imagination. The Depression had emptied most rural bank branches. The legendary safecracker who gets away with tens of thousands of dollars is a movie version of a Barrow Gang robbery. The actual version more often yielded a few $100s, sometimes less. There were days, well-documented days, when the gang's total take from a robbery was not enough to cover their gas money. They were not master criminals. They were young, scared, broke people with guns, making snap decisions in the heat of the moment, and that combination, youth, fear, poverty, and firearms, was catastrophic in ways that unfolded gradually over 2 years. The first killing attributed to the Barrow Gang occurred in April of 1932. A store owner in Hillsboro, Texas, named John Bucher, was shot during a robbery. The exact circumstances are, as with many events in this story, disputed, but he died, and his death changed everything, because it meant that this was no longer a matter for local law enforcement managing petty theft. This was murder. The investigation intensified immediately. Rewards were posted. Law enforcement across Texas began coordinating in ways they hadn't before, and Bonnie was arrested. In June of 1932, Bonnie was caught in Kaufman County, Texas, after a robbery attempt went wrong. Clyde escaped. Bonnie was left behind. She was held in the Kaufman County Jail for several months while the district attorney tried to build a case against her. The case didn't hold. There was insufficient evidence to prosecute her for the specific charges, and she was eventually released. But her time in the Kaufman jail was significant for several reasons. First, it gave her a period of enforced stillness, time to think, to write, to correspond with her mother and with Clyde. The letters she wrote from jail are among the most revealing documents we have from her. They show a woman who was frightened, who missed her mother desperately, who had not entirely reckoned with what she had committed herself to, and yet when she was released, she went back to Clyde. She always went back to Clyde. The summer and fall of 1932 brought more robberies, more close calls, and the gang's first direct confrontation with law enforcement in the form of a shooting. In August, Clyde and another gang member were stopped by a sheriff in Atoka County, Oklahoma. The confrontation escalated. 2 officers were shot, one fatally. Clyde and his companion fled. A noose tightened another notch. By late 1932, the Barrow Gang had become a known entity to law enforcement across multiple states. They were on wanted lists in Texas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. The newspapers were beginning to cover them, not yet with the full-blown mythologizing that would come later, but with the particular mixture of horror and fascination that American crime journalism has always brought to its most dramatic subjects. Then the gang kept moving. This is one of the things about the Barrow Gang's criminal career that is worth understanding clearly. They survived as long as they did almost entirely because of mobility. Clyde Barrow was, by all credible accounts, an extraordinary driver, fast, fearless, instinctive. He had modified their cars personally, reinforcing the chassis, adjusting the engines for speed and reliability, learning the mechanical idiosyncrasies of each vehicle, the way a musician learns an instrument. He also had a remarkable spatial memory for roads. At a time before GPS, before interstate highways, before the standardized road systems that we now take for granted, Clyde Barrow carried in his head a mental map of the back roads of Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Louisiana, Arkansas, and the surrounding states. He knew which roads were paved and which turned to mud in the rain. He knew where the county lines were. Crossing a county line meant leaving the jurisdiction of one set of officers and entering another, buying precious time. He used this knowledge constantly. The gang rarely stayed in one place more than a night or two. They slept in the car more often than not, all of them, cramped into the back seat with their weapons and their small collections of personal possessions, parked on some remote road watching the darkness through the windows. It was not, by any reasonable measure, a life. It was cold in the winter, brutally hot in the Texas summer. The constant movement was physically exhausting. Food was irregular. Personal hygiene was, by necessity, improvised. There were no comfortable beds, no fixed addresses, no privacy. And yet there was something that several people who had contact with Bonnie and Clyde during these years remarked on, something that comes through even in the documents and photographs that survive. They were happy together. Not always, not simply, but there is a consistency in the accounts of people who encountered them, in the letters they wrote, in the photographs that were famously found after one of their abandoned campsites was discovered by police, a happiness, a lightness that existed between them even in the midst of everything else. One of those photographs, one that became iconic, shows Bonnie posing playfully with a large pistol, her foot propped on the car's front bumper, a cigar in her mouth. She is grinning. The photograph was intended as a joke, taken by Clyde for Bonnie's own amusement. When the police found that photograph, they used it as evidence of her dangerous character. When the newspapers published it, the public found it fascinating and glamorous. When Bonnie's mother saw it, she was mortified. Emma Parker spent years insisting that her daughter did not actually smoke cigars. The photograph tells you something about how many different things a single image can mean, depending on who is looking at it and what they bring to the looking. The fall and winter of 1932 into 1933 brought a significant addition to the Barrow Gang. Clyde's older brother, Ivan Barrow, known as Buck, and his wife, Blanche. Buck Barrow had served time in the same Texas prison system that had shaped Clyde, and he had emerged from it with the same deep resistance to returning. He and Blanche had married in 1931, and by early 1933, Buck had decided against Blanche's wishes, according to her own later account, to join his brother. Blanche Barrow is a fascinating figure in this story who tends to get lost between the larger legends of Bonnie and Clyde. She was, by her own description, and by the accounts of people who knew her, someone who deeply did not want to be there. She was not a criminal. She had not chosen this life. She had chosen Buck, and Buck had chosen Clyde, and here she was. She kept a diary during her time with the gang. That diary, which survived and has been published, is one of the most remarkable primary documents from this period, a day-by-day account of life on the run that contains almost none of the glamour of the legend, and almost all of the exhaustion, fear, and grinding discomfort of the reality. Blanche Barrow is the person in the story who makes it hardest to maintain the romantic narrative. Because she was just trying to stay alive, and she knew it. The spring of 1933 brought the gang to Joplin, Missouri, where they rented a garage apartment and attempted, for a brief, domestic, almost surreal period, to live something resembling a normal life. They cooked meals, they played cards, Buck and Clyde worked on the cars. It lasted 2 weeks. On April 13, 1933, local police responded to a tip and converged on the Joplin apartment. What followed was a gunfight that lasted several minutes and resulted in the deaths of 2 officers. The gang escaped barely in a hail of gunfire, with Blanche reportedly running alongside the moving car before managing to get inside. But they left things behind. Things that would change everything. In the Joplin apartment, police found clothing, food, and personal belongings. They found stolen goods. They found weapons. And they found a camera. And film. The photographs developed from that film, the playful, relaxed, intimate photographs that Bonnie and Clyde had taken of themselves and each other in moments of downtime, were turned over to the newspapers, and the newspapers published them everywhere. America had faces now. Not just names on a wanted poster, faces of young people who looked in those photographs in that specific, casual way, like people you might know, like your neighbor's kids, like the couple at the end of the street. The public fascination, which had been building, exploded. And the gang drove on. The summer of 1933 was the bloodiest period of the gang's existence. More robberies, more shootings, 2 more officers killed in separate incidents. The rewards climbed, the coverage intensified. And then, in July of 1933, near Platte City, Missouri, the gang was ambushed at a motel by a large force of armed officers. In the ensuing gunfight, Buck Barrow was shot in the head. Blanche was wounded. The gang escaped, but Buck was critically injured. They drove. They kept driving because there was nothing else to do. Buck lay in the back of the car, barely conscious, while Clyde navigated back roads in the dark. 5 days later, near Dexter, Iowa, they were ambushed again. This time, they were surrounded. In the chaos of that second ambush, Buck Barrow was shot again, multiple times. He died in a hospital in Dexter several days later. He was 29 years old. Blanche Barrow was captured at the scene. She was tried and convicted and served 6 years in a Missouri prison. She lived until 1988. She spent most of those decades trying, largely unsuccessfully, to escape the shadow of those 2 weeks on the road. Clyde Barrow had lost his brother. The person who knew him longest. The person who had been through Eastham with him, who understood without explanation what that experience had done. The person who was, in a way that went beyond blood, his anchor to whoever he had been before all of this. And at the same July ambush near Platte City, something else happened that would mark Bonnie Parker for the rest of her short life. The car they were driving went off a bridge embankment in the dark and burst into flames. Clyde, though burned on his arm and back, got himself out. He went back into the burning car and pulled Bonnie out. But not before the flames had reached her legs. The burns were severe, not just painful, disfiguring. Deep burns on her right leg that left the limb partially contracted, the knee pulling upward, making it almost impossible for her to walk unassisted. For weeks after the incident, she could not walk at all. Clyde carried her when they needed to move quickly. He bathed her wounds. He held her when the pain was worst. She was 22 years old. Her leg would never fully heal. And she stayed. The question of why she stayed, why she didn't take the opportunity of her incapacity to separate from Clyde, to seek medical care, to return to her mother who desperately wanted her back, is one that has occupied everyone who has ever told this story. Emma Parker, in her later years, said she asked Bonnie this question directly, during one of the secret meetings that Emma and Clyde's mother Kumi arranged with their children, meetings that law enforcement knew about but allowed to continue. Partly as a way of monitoring the gang's movements, Emma reportedly pleaded with Bonnie to come home. Bonnie said she couldn't. Not wouldn't, couldn't. Emma Parker interpreted this as meaning that Bonnie was afraid of what Clyde would do if she tried to leave. Historians have debated this interpretation. The evidence from Bonnie's own writings, her poems, her letters, suggests something more complex. A woman who had made a choice, fully and with open eyes, and who was living inside that choice completely. Whether that constitutes freedom or captivity is a question I'll leave with you. The answer probably depends on what you think freedom is. While the Barrow Gang was writing its increasingly violent and chaotic story across the back roads of the American South and Midwest, the people responsible for ending that story were beginning to organize. And the most important of those people was a man named Francis Augustus Hamer. Frank Hamer. If Bonnie and Clyde represent one strain of American mythology, the outlaw strain, the romantic fugitive strain, the strain that shows up in folk songs and movies and on the back of playing cards, then Frank Hamer represents another strain entirely, the lawman strain, the relentless, implacable forces of order strain. He was born in 1884 in Fayette County, Texas. He grew up in a hardscrabble environment, not entirely unlike the ones that produced Bonnie and Clyde, which is worth noting. The difference between the man who became Frank Hamer and the man who became Clyde Barrow was not primarily a difference in background or economic circumstance. It was a difference in the choices made at critical moments, and perhaps in what those choices were measured against. Hamer joined the Texas Rangers in 1906. He was 22 years old, and from the beginning, he was understood to be something unusual even by the elevated standards of an organization that had always attracted unusual people. He was physically imposing, tall, broad, with a stillness about him that people who encountered him described as unnerving, not threatening exactly, just very, very certain, like a man who had made his peace with what his life was going to require of him, and who was not troubled by the specifics. Over the course of his career with the Rangers, Hamer was shot 17 times. He survived all 17. He was ambushed, beaten, left for dead on at least 2 occasions. He survived those too. He became, in the language of his time and place, a legend, the kind of lawman that the mythology of the American West had been building toward for decades. By 1934, however, Frank Hamer had officially retired from the Rangers. He was 50 years old. He had been in law enforcement for nearly 3 decades. He had earned his rest. He was brought out of that retirement specifically for Bonnie and Clyde. The Texas Department of Corrections, specifically Lee Simmons, the superintendent of the Texas prison system, contacted Hamer in January of 1934. The Barrow Gang had, the previous year, carried out a raid on Eastham prison farm that was the proximate cause of Hamer's involvement. In January of 1934, Clyde Barrow had helped engineer the escape of several prisoners from Eastham, the place that had made him what he was. The escape involved smuggling guns into the prison and creating a violent diversion. A guard was killed in the process. For Lee Simmons, this was personal. The raid on Eastham was not just a criminal act, it was a humiliation. It was a direct attack on the institution he ran, carried out by a man that institution had created. He hired Frank Hamer to end it. Hamer's approach to the investigation was methodical in a way that contrasted sharply with the frantic, reactive law enforcement the gang had been evading for 2 years. He didn't chase them. Chasing them hadn't worked for anyone else. Instead, he traced them, going back through their history, mapping their movements, identifying the patterns that 2 years of constant motion had created. Because even people who are always moving have patterns. They have people they trust, places they return to, routes that feel familiar, and those patterns, invisible in the moment, become visible when you step back and look at enough data. Hamer traveled to the sites of their crimes. He interviewed witnesses. He built slowly and carefully a picture of where the gang had been, how they moved, who they trusted, and where they were likely to be. He identified, correctly, that the gang had a tendency to return to Louisiana, specifically to Bienville Parish in the northwestern part of the state, where a member of the gang named Henry Methvin had family. Henry Methvin was one of the prisoners freed in the Eastham raid. He had joined the gang in the aftermath of that operation, and had been traveling with Bonnie and Clyde since early 1934. He was young, 22, and he was, in the assessment of people who knew him, more follower than leader. He had attached himself to Clyde the way young men sometimes attach themselves to people who seem certain when everything else is uncertain. But Henry Methvin had a father, Ivy Methvin, and Ivy Methvin was a man who lived in Bienville Parish and who had a very direct interest in his son surviving the situation the son had gotten himself into. It was Ivy Methvin who made contact with law enforcement. The exact nature and extent of the arrangement he made is something historians have debated for decades. What is clear is that Ivy Methvin provided information about the route his son and the Barrow Gang were likely to travel through Bienville Parish in late May of 1934, and that information was passed to Frank Hamer. Whether Henry Methvin knew his father had made this arrangement is unclear. Whether Bonnie and Clyde had any sense that their trust had been compromised is equally unclear. What is clear is that on the evening of May 22, 1934, Frank Hamer assembled a team of 6 officers. 4 Texas officers, himself and 3 others, and 2 Louisiana officers, including the Henderson County Sheriff, Henderson Jordan, who had jurisdiction in the area where the ambush was to be set. They drove out to a stretch of Route 154, also known as Ringgold Road, in Bienville Parish. They parked their cars in the tree line on either side of the road in the shadow of the pine trees, and they waited. They set Ivy Methvin's truck in the road as a decoy, the idea being that Clyde, seeing a familiar vehicle broken down on the roadside, would slow or stop, giving the officers the advantage of a stationary target. And then they waited. They waited through the afternoon, through the evening, through the night. 6 men in the tree line, in the dark, in the May heat of rural Louisiana. No lights, very little sound beyond the insects and the distant calling of nightbirds. It was, in its way, an act of extraordinary patience. Dawn came. The light changed slowly, the way it does in pine country, not all at once, but in gradual increments, the darkness thinning and then graying, and then finally becoming the pale, flat light of a Louisiana morning. The officers held their positions. And then, at approximately 9:15 in the morning, they heard it. An engine. A tan Ford V8, traveling at normal highway speed, came around the curve in the road from the north. Clyde Barrow was driving. He was wearing his socks and a shirt, but no shoes. He had a habit of driving without shoes, for the feel of the pedals. Beside him, Bonnie Parker was eating a sandwich. A deli bag was open in her lap. The car slowed slightly as Clyde saw Ivy Methvin's truck in the road. And Frank Hamer gave the signal. What followed was not a confrontation. There was no call to surrender, no warning shots, no negotiation. 130 bullets were fired in approximately 15 seconds. The official reports indicate that the officers began firing almost simultaneously, from multiple angles, at the moment the car slowed. The volume of fire was such that there was no possibility of survival for anyone inside the vehicle. The tan Ford V8 drifted slowly to the right side of the road and came to a stop in the grass at the road's edge. Inside it were two people. Bonnie Parker, 23 years old. Clyde Barrow, 25. The coroner's report documented the number of wounds. It is not something that needs repeating in detail here. It is enough to say that they had not survived the first seconds of the ambush. Frank Hamer walked to the car. He looked inside. He reportedly said nothing. He was not a man given to public statements about what he felt. If this kind of storytelling is something you want more of, stories told at a pace that lets them breathe about real people who lived real lives, subscribing to the channel takes just a moment, and it means the next story finds its way to you. We're almost at the end now. Stay with me. Word of the ambush spread through the surrounding communities within hours, and people came. They came from nearby towns, Gibbsland, Arcadia, Salas. They came from further away, people who had heard the news on the radio or who had received telephone calls from someone who had been there. They came in cars and on foot, and they gathered at the side of Ringgold Road, and they looked at the tan Ford V8 with its shattered windows and its perforated body, and they tried to make it real. It was the same impulse that drives people to the sites of disasters and assassinations and catastrophic events. The need to stand in the place where something enormous happened and feel the enormousness of it through the soles of your feet. The need to make history physical. Some of them tried to take souvenirs, pieces of glass from the shattered windows, locks of hair from the bodies before the officers could prevent it. One man reportedly tried to cut off Clyde's ear. Frank Hamer and his team had to physically restrain the crowd. The bodies were taken to Arcadia, Louisiana, where the undertaker, a man named Conger, reportedly had to keep the crowds out of his establishment by force. The line of people who wanted to see Bonnie and Clyde, dead in the back room of a funeral home in a small Louisiana town, stretched down the street and around the corner. More than 10,000 people passed through Arcadia in the days following the ambush. This response, the crowds, the souvenirs, the pilgrimage quality of it, tells you something that the wanted posters don't. It tells you what Bonnie and Clyde had meant to the country that had been watching them. To understand that meaning, you have to return to the context of 1934 America, 5 years into the Great Depression. 1 in 4 Americans unemployed, banks that had failed, taking the savings of millions of ordinary people, a federal government under President Roosevelt, who had been in office barely a year, that was attempting emergency measures on a scale never before tried, but whose results were uncertain and slow to materialize. In this environment, the institutions that ordinary Americans had been told to trust, banks, corporations, law enforcement, government, had either failed them or had come to seem actively hostile to their interests. The bank that foreclosed on your farm, the factory that laid you off without notice, the police who came to evict your neighbor. And then there were Bonnie and Clyde, who robbed banks, who ran from the law, who were young and together and in motion and alive in a way that the gray, static, defeated atmosphere of Depression-era America was not. I want to be careful here, because this is the point at which the Bonnie and Clyde mythology tends to veer into something that dishonors the people they killed. 13 people, at minimum, died as a result of the Barrow Gang's activities. Most of them were law enforcement officers. They were fathers and husbands and sons. They had families who received telegrams and wept, and lived with the absence for the rest of their lives. That is real. It has to be held alongside everything else. But the fact that the public's response to Bonnie and Clyde was what it was, the fascination, the sympathy, the crowds at the funeral home, that is also real, and it tells us something important about a society under tremendous stress, about what happens to a population's relationship with law and order when those institutions have conspicuously failed to protect ordinary people. Crime historians use the term social banditry for this phenomenon. The concept originates with the British historian Eric Hobsbawm, who studied the patterns by which certain criminals become folk heroes in their own time and place. The social bandit, in Hobsbawm's analysis, is typically someone who comes from the oppressed class, who challenges the symbols of the oppressing class, usually property, and who, in doing so, becomes a figure of vicarious resistance for people who are oppressed but who lack the means or the courage or the desperation to act themselves. Robin Hood is the archetype. Jesse James and Billy the Kid are American versions. John Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd were Bonnie and Clyde's contemporaries and served the same mythological function. None of them were actually robbing from the rich to give to the poor. That part is always the story that gets added later, by the people who need the story to be cleaner than it was. The reality is that Bonnie and Clyde, like Jesse James, robbed from anyone who had something worth taking and kept it. But they were perceived as being against the same things their audience was against. And perception, in the construction of myth, is everything. The aftermath of the ambush was handled, as these things often are, imperfectly, and in ways that revealed the discomfort of the people involved with what had happened. Frank Hamer was publicly praised. He was given commendations. The reward money, a substantial sum, was divided among the members of the ambush team. Hamer himself was reportedly uncomfortable with the level of public attention and declined most requests for interviews. He did not, by most accounts, feel triumphant. What he felt, if he felt anything beyond the flat professional satisfaction of a completed task, is not something the historical record reveals. The bodies of Bonnie and Clyde were returned to Texas. Emma Parker, who had been secretly meeting with her daughter throughout the 2 years of the gang's activities, had requested that Bonnie be buried near her in Dallas. She got her wish. Eventually, Bonnie was buried at the Crown Hill Cemetery in Dallas. The funeral drew thousands of people. The streets outside the cemetery were lined. Clyde's family buried him at Western Heights Cemetery, also in Dallas. The graves are there today. People still visit them. Emma Parker and Kumi Barrow, who had both been watching their children run toward this ending for 2 years, who had both known it was coming and had been unable to prevent it, attended each other's children's funerals. 2 mothers from the same neighborhood, burying children who had grown up less than 20 miles apart. There are not many images in this story that cut quite as cleanly as that one. The legal aftermath of the Barrow Gang's career was, in many ways, anticlimactic. Blanche Barrow had already been convicted and was serving her sentence in a Missouri prison. Henry Methvin, whose father's cooperation had enabled the ambush, was tried for the murder of 2 Texas Highway Patrol officers and was initially convicted and sentenced to death. The conviction was later overturned as part of the arrangement his father had made with law enforcement. He was eventually released and lived until 1948, when he was struck by a train and killed. Ray Hamilton, the early gang member who had been present during some of the first robberies, was tried and convicted on multiple charges and was executed in the electric chair at Huntsville in May of 1935, almost exactly 1 year after Bonnie and Clyde died on that Louisiana road. The prison system that had made Clyde Barrow what he was continued operating in largely the same manner for years afterward. The conditions at Eastham and similar Texas prison farms did not immediately change in response to the events of 1932 to 1934. Reform came slowly, over decades, through the work of advocates and lawyers and eventually through judicial intervention. But that is a different story. I want to spend some time, before we reach the end of this story, with something that tends to get treated as a footnote. Bonnie Parker's writing. Because it is not a footnote, it is, in many ways, the clearest window we have into who she actually was, not the newspaper version, not the movie version, not the legend, but the person. Bonnie wrote throughout her life, from childhood through her brief, unhappy marriage, through the years on the road. She wrote poems mostly, short, direct, rhythmically simple poems that did not reach for sophistication but consistently reached for truth. She also wrote letters, lots of letters, to her mother primarily, but also to Clyde, to friends, to the occasional journalist who had somehow made contact. The letters to her mother are heartbreaking in a specific, quiet way. They are the letters of a person who loves her mother deeply and who is also doing something she knows her mother would not forgive. They are full of reassurances that read in retrospect as the things you say to someone when you can't say the true thing. She described weather. She described meals. She described Clyde's health and her own, carefully, without details that would cause too much alarm. She wrote about missing home, about missing the particular smell of her mother's kitchen, about missing the ordinary texture of a life she had chosen to leave. She never asked to come home, but she wrote about home constantly. Emma Parker kept every letter. She published many of them, years after Bonnie's death. In a memoir she wrote partly to correct what she saw as the false portrait of her daughter that the press and the movies had created. Emma Parker's Bonnie was not the cigar-smoking, gun-toting femme fatale of the wanted posters. She was a small, bright, funny, affectionate young woman who had made a catastrophic choice for reasons that her mother understood but could never entirely forgive. Both versions are true. The poems. Bonnie's most famous poem, known as *The Story of Bonnie and Clyde*, was written sometime in 1934. The exact date is not known, but internal evidence suggests it was in the months before her death, when she seems to have had a clear and unsentimental sense of how the story was going to end. The poem is written in a ballad style, regular meter and rhymes, the form of a traditional narrative poem. It moves through the story of the gang with the kind of matter-of-fact directness that characterizes all of Bonnie's best writing. There is no self-pity in it, no appeal for sympathy. There is instead a flat, clear-eyed recognition of what their life was and where it was going. In the final stanzas she writes about death, about the way it will come. She does not flinch from it. She describes it as something she has accepted, not welcomed, not desired, but accepted. And she asks that whoever finds her body treat it with some dignity. That request, in the context of what actually happened after the ambush, the crowds trying to cut locks of her hair, the man who attempted to cut off Clyde's ear, the 10,000 people who filed through the funeral home, is almost unbearably sad. She had seen it coming. She had asked for something she didn't get. The other poem worth knowing about is one she wrote earlier, the one that people who study this story most often return to as the purest expression of how Bonnie understood her own life. It is a short poem, just a few stanzas. It describes a girl who wanted ordinary things, love, a home, a life, and who ended up somewhere she never expected, with a person she couldn't leave, on a road that had no good ending. What is remarkable about it is not the sentiment, it is the clarity, the complete absence of self-deception. Bonnie Parker, who was 22 or 23 when she wrote it, understood her situation with a precision that most people never achieve about their own lives. She understood and she stayed. That is either the most romantic thing in this story or the most tragic, or both. There is one more piece of Bonnie's writing that deserves mention. Shortly before her death, she gave her mother a poem during one of their secret meetings. Emma Parker later described this as a goodbye, that Bonnie, in handing over that poem, was saying something she couldn't say in words. Emma kept the poem. She read it at her daughter's funeral. She kept it the rest of her life. She died in 1945, 11 years after Bonnie. She never recovered from losing her daughter. By her own account and the accounts of everyone who knew her, Emma Parker spent the last decade of her life in a grief that was managed but never resolved. That, too, is part of the story. 90 years. 90 years have passed since that morning on a Louisiana road, and Bonnie and Clyde are still here. In a Nevada casino, the bullet-riddled Ford V8 sits under glass. 106 holes in the body of the car. Tourists line up to photograph it. Some of them reach out to touch the metal through the barriers, drawn by the same impulse that brought 10,000 people to Arcadia, Louisiana, in the spring of 1934. The need to make history physical. The need to press your hand against the surface of something and feel the distance between then and now. In Dallas, there are 2 graves. They're in separate cemeteries. Bonnie and Clyde didn't get to be buried together, which is a detail that, depending on your sensibility, is either a sad footnote or a fitting ending to a story about 2 people who were separated more often than they were together, and who kept finding their way back to each other anyway. People leave things at the graves: flowers, notes, coins, the occasional bottle of whiskey. The graves of people who become legends accumulate these offerings the way old trees accumulate rings, slowly, year by year, each one a small evidence of someone who came and stood there and felt something they needed to express. The 1967 film. We have to talk about the 1967 film because it is the single most important thing that happened to the Bonnie and Clyde story after 1934. Arthur Penn directed it. Warren Beatty played Clyde. Faye Dunaway played Bonnie. It was released at a specific charged moment in American cultural history, 1967, the year that the Vietnam War was tearing the country apart, that the civil rights movement was entering its most confrontational phase, that a generation of young Americans was in open, sometimes violent conflict with the institutions and authorities of the society they had inherited. The film found in Bonnie and Clyde exactly the story that moment needed. 2 beautiful young people, a corrupt and violent system, a love story set against a backdrop of state-sanctioned violence, an ending in which the heroes are cut down not in fair confrontation but in an ambush, an overwhelming, impersonal, mechanical execution. The film was controversial when it was released. Many critics found it irresponsible, too sympathetic to criminals, too aestheticized in its violence, too willing to make outlaws into heroes. Roger Ebert gave it 4 stars. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times hated it so much that he wrote 3 separate negative reviews. The public loved it. It was one of the highest-grossing films of 1967. It was nominated for 10 Academy Awards. It won 2. Faye Dunaway's hair became one of the most imitated styles of the late 1960s. The film's use of slow motion in the final ambush sequence became one of the most referenced and imitated filmmaking choices in the history of American cinema. And it did something permanent to the Bonnie and Clyde legend. Before 1967, they were a fading Depression-era memory, still known, still referenced occasionally, but receding into history the way things do when the people who lived through them start to die off. After 1967, they were icons, permanent, embedded in the cultural landscape, the way that a very few historical figures manage to become. Frank Hamer's widow, Mildred Hamer, sued the filmmakers for the portrayal of her husband, which depicted him as a vindictive, incompetent, almost comic villain. She won a settlement. The amount was not publicly disclosed. Frank Hamer himself had died in 1955. He never saw the film. He never talked much about the ambush. In the years after 1934, he gave very few interviews on the subject. He returned to private life. He did some security consulting, some investigative work, the normal second career of a retired lawman. He was interviewed occasionally by journalists who wanted the Bonnie and Clyde story from his perspective. He was, reportedly, unwilling to provide what they wanted. He didn't think of himself as the villain of the story. He didn't think of himself as the hero. He thought of himself as someone who had done a job that needed doing, under circumstances that were not clean and did not have clean answers. Whether that self-assessment is accurate, whether the ambush was justified, whether a warning should have been given, whether the scale of the response was proportionate, is something that has been debated ever since. What is not debated is that it ended 2 lives. Lives that had started under a bridge and in a small Texas town, respectively. Lives that had intersected on a January evening in 1930 and had been intertwined inseparably from that moment until the morning of May 23, 1934. 4 years. That is how long the Bonnie and Clyde story lasted, from the January evening when they met to the May morning when it ended. 4 years. Less time than it takes to complete a college education. Less time than most car loans. Less time than the average sentence Clyde Barrow served at Eastham Prison Farm. 4 years that produced more myth, more cultural weight, more ongoing fascination than most lives of 70 or 80 years. Why? I've been thinking about this question for a long time, and I keep coming back to a few things. First, the timing. Bonnie and Clyde existed at exactly the right or wrong moment in American history. The Depression had created a population that was angry, frightened, and desperate for something to believe in that wasn't the system that had failed them. Into that hunger came 2 young people who seemed, in the compressed mythology of newspaper coverage, to be living outside the rules, to be choosing velocity over stasis, to be refusing the slow death of poverty and hopelessness in favor of something fast and bright and dangerous. Second, the love story. Human beings are, at the deepest level, creatures who understand narrative through relationship. We find meaning in connection, and the Bonnie and Clyde story is, at its core, a love story, improbable, dark, ultimately tragic, but real. The letters, the photographs, the accounts of people who saw them together, they leave no doubt that Bonnie and Clyde were genuinely, deeply attached to each other. In a world of Depression-era gray and exhaustion, that attachment was vivid and strange and alive. It captured people's imaginations and held them. Third, the ending. There is something in the structure of the Bonnie and Clyde story that is almost mythologically perfect. It builds, it escalates, and then it ends suddenly, definitively, at the age when both of them were still young enough to be grieved as young people. There is no middle age for Bonnie and Clyde, no slow decline, no compromised, complicated later life that might have complicated the legend. The story is sealed, complete, and that completeness gives it a power that ongoing, unfinished lives rarely have. And fourth, and I think this might be the most important thing, the story is honest about the cost. Bonnie Parker's poetry makes sure of that. Those poems don't let you off the hook. They don't let you have the romance without the reality. They say, clearly and without sentiment, that this is what it costs. This is what the road looks like when you're living on it. These are the nights and the cold and the fear and the pain and the knowledge of what is coming. And yet there is also, in those poems, something that endures, something that the cost didn't extinguish. The love, the choice, the peculiar dark freedom of two people who decided together to live on their own terms. However briefly. However expensively. On their own terms. I don't know what to do with that. I have told this story as carefully and honestly as I can. I have tried to give the victims their weight. I have tried to give Bonnie and Clyde their complexity, neither heroes nor simply monsters, but people, real, specific, fully human people who grew up in circumstances that shaped them and made choices that defined them and died young on a flat road in Louisiana on a May morning in 1934. They drove that road in a tan Ford V8. Bonnie was eating a sandwich. Clyde wasn't wearing his shoes. The windows were down. It was a warm morning, still. Pine trees on both sides. And for just a moment before everything else, it was just a road. Going somewhere. And two people in a car. Driving. Thank you for spending this time here. If this kind of storytelling is something you want more of, real people, real stories told slowly and with care, subscribing to the channel is the best way to find your way back. Just hit the button below. There are more roads to travel, more lives to sit with. Rest well, and I'll see you on the next one.